Many thanks to you also, Your Excellency. You may be seated. And so just to build on some of the points that have been made about the importance of not looking at infrastructure in terms of the physical buildings and roads and bridges that are produced, but looking at the human capital. We're going to dive into that discussion in just a moment. But before we do, can I ask for your participation once again? The questions. So there's going to be a QR code once again that's going to come up on the screen just to get a sense of what the current workforce is looking like. We're talking about building the future, but what does the present look like right now? The first question that you can anticipate on your screen essentially will reflect the number of jobs. The number of jobs that Africa as a whole produces every year. You've got 4 options to choose from. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, I'm interested to hear what you think. So those who are participating for the first time, please just scan the QR code and just give us your response as to how many jobs you think the continent creates every year. Is it 100 million? Is it 42? Is it on the lower end, the 12 and the 3 million? Thank you for the responses that are coming through. We'll just give a moment more for those of you who haven't yet selected your choice. Okay, I think that most of us in the room have done so. So let's see those results. A very, very close call. Okay, so the results are still moving. Kindly just give us a moment. Okay, but 3 million. 3 million formal jobs Africa produces as a whole per year. Very frightening statistics if you think about the population size that is able to work. But the next question, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like your participation on, if you please. How many formal jobs does Africa need to generate every year at a minimum? So we moved from what we're currently doing, but now I'm asking you to tell me what we need to do every year at a minimum to rise to our potential, as it were, but more importantly, to give deserving Africans on this continent the dignity of being able to take care of themselves and their families. So how many formal jobs does Africa need to generate every year at a minimum? I believe that the result there says 15. So in keeping with the topic, I would like to invite a gentleman who will lead us in setting the scene for infrastructure as an economic multiplier. Of course, infrastructure as a multiplier of economies, but also the future workforce. So as a creator of jobs. The gentleman's name is Mr. Bright Simmons. And of course, he does represent, if you just give me a moment, he does represent M Pedigree as the president, but also the founder of the organization. So Bright, kindly ask you to join us on stage to set the scene. Thank you, sir.
Should I stand there? Good morning. As I wait for my slides to come up, I first want to thank Africa 50 for this very prestigious invitation, and to all the organizers for the amazing work that has been done. I'm going after the very eloquent former president of Tanzania. So this is a terrifying task, but I hope that I'll be able to present some provocations that will be of use to the panel. First of all, I'm really, really excited to be back in Tanzania. It's an amazing country, and the energy and the vibrations kind of stay with you for a very long time. my short presentation is really to make a few remarks that hopefully will influence some of the conversations that we're going to have about infrastructure as a multiplier of the economy in relation to job creation, but particularly in the context of technology. So I do need a few moments for the slides to load up so I can use those as props to go through. Yes, wonderful, wonderful, delightful. I have two tools in my toolkit for this talk. The first one is a concept in infrastructure that emanates from work that we've been doing at Imani and ODI. And the second one is in relation to the impact of technology in the economy, particularly the real economy, the interplay of technology in the real economy. Now, these two tools in the toolkit essentially provide the lens through which I'm going to make my observations. On the technology front, so essentially, the initial work stems from evidence that comes from looking closely at artificial intelligence and looking at how artificial intelligence actually manifests in the real economy. So I'm going to generalize later from artificial intelligence to technology as a whole, but to get you to understand where we start coming from, it's helpful to know the origins of the logic. And the origins is that when you take artificial intelligence, it is very easy to be, it's very easy to be tempted into thinking that you are dealing with one uniform or monolithic technology. But actually, it's not. The way that artificial intelligence manifests in the economy can be roughly approximated by this 3x3 slide. And what you're looking at reflects how, over time, AI moves from the verbal outputs and artifacts that has become associated with likes of ChatGPT, so the ability to ask the AI to generate a contract, to generate a manual, that kind of thing, through logical mechanisms such as agentic workflows, and eventually AI start to hit the real world, the physical world, the physical environment, through sensors and stuff like that. Now, that transmission or that transition from the verbal, deductive, I would say clerical type of work into the kind of worlds that we're dealing with engineering, we're dealing with manufacturing, we're dealing with agriculture, etc., is the biggest transition in the nature of the technology as it moves forwards. So this is basically a broad picture of AI transitions as we're observing now in the world. Now, my argument is that you can generalize that concept from artificial intelligence to all forms of technology. In this tool that I'm currently presenting, we're distinguishing between two main kinds of technologies, or rather two forms in which technology in the real economy is shaped. One form is what I'm calling enclave tech, and the other form is what I'm calling embedded tech. So enclave tech primarily is the kind of technology that can sit side by side without transformation. So essentially, a lot of the current use of artificial intelligence and other forms of technology that we've seen, even in the mobility area, the mobile technology area, has been enclave in the nature that they don't necessarily require transformation in the real economy in order to be applicable, in order to be useful in some way, in order to generate returns in some way. Embedded technology, on the other hand, requires that we make fundamental changes to the nature of the economic system in order for that technology to be absorbable, in order for that technology to be adopted, in order for that technology to make impact. So that transition from AI as a much more narrow category to this generalized picture of the way technology behaves by distinguishing between enclave technologies and embedded technologies is the first tool. So this is the first tool in the toolkit that I'm going to use to make my subsequent points. The second point, the second tool in this toolkit is this idea that we call corridor premium. And the work originates from a paradox. The paradox is that when you look at data sets like Moody's, GEMS, or infrastructure default rates in the world, Africa appears to have a very low default rate. So in one data set, for instance, only 5% of project funding defaults in Africa versus 5.9% in Europe and 12.9% in Latin America. And yet still, as we all know, cost of capital for infrastructure in Africa and availability of capital for infrastructure in Africa is very low. Some have described this as a pure problem of misperception of risk, of some even say even bigotry or bias. The truth, though, is that African domestic investors don't charge any less, and in many ways are even more risk averse. So it cannot only be irrational bias. There must be something else going on. What you discover, and I'm not saying that bias is not an issue, bias is definitely an issue, but what you'll discover is that in addition to that, there is this challenge that has not been adequately understood. And that challenge is that in Africa, every major or mega project is itself a corridor. There's a tendency to distinguish between projects and corridors, but because of the patchiness of infrastructure in the context, what you have is that every time you're putting in a major project, you're almost dealing with a corridor. An example would be in the data center space for artificial intelligence, where you need multiple complements in terms of inference pipelines, where you need the actual data centers themselves, and you need downstream capabilities in skills, etc., etc., etc. The truth is that today, one single Texas data center has more capacity than the entire African together. There's a single data center that has about 1,200 megawatts, and that exceeds total data center capacity in the continent. So in that kind of intense infrastructure deficit, every time you try to introduce a mega project into the context, that project is dealing with unavailable dependencies, which then effectively mean that your weakest link becomes the dominant determinant of cost of capital in the entire project ecosystem. So now that I've described those two tools, we now have a composite view made up of one view around enclave tech and embedded tech, and another view about this notion of the corridor premium. And what happens when you combine those two perspectives is that you start to address this issue of idle labor. Not entirely idle, because as I'm going to explain in a moment, informality is not necessarily idleness, but what it does do is significantly lower the productivity of even your best minds. And the fascinating problem that we have with stranded brain power in Africa is that a lot of the people that are currently informally employed, currently not fully harnessed in terms of their brain power, are those working precisely in those areas where heavy lifting is most critical. The mechanical area, the auto garages, those that are primarily doing the spatial and abductive work. So the auto garages, the traditional artisanal areas, the people doing the informal mining, the people that are in subsistence agriculture, everyone using their hands, working in the spatial domain, is then in this model heavily underutilized. And so the formal work that we describe in the moment, which we say, okay, we're creating about 3 million, it's not the 50 million formal jobs that we need. The truth is that a lot of those formal jobs are in the verbal, clerical, some will even argue provocatively, the colonial domain. That's where we are creating the so-called formal jobs. The informal jobs in agriculture, in basic fabrication and manufacturing, in instrumentation, etc., those informal jobs are actually the foundation for transforming Africa because they are in those spatial and adaptive realms where true transformation of the real economy can happen. That raises fascinating problems, but also incredible hope. Because what it means is that we have reservoir brains. We have a stock of latent power, intellectual power, cognitive power that is under-harnessed because of informality. Because these people do not have certificates imposed by a colonial form of education, imposed by a clerical form of education, and yet still their skill set, their capacity is what we're going to require to transform the economy. And when you look at those places in the world like Kamukunji, like Ladipo in Lagos, like Swami in Magazine in Ghana, etc., the vast majority of their capacity and their output is not even recorded. And because the AI 10 relies on information that has been codified and put on the internet, what that means effectively is that our strongest suite as a continent, that's our strongest capacity as a continent, has not even been codified and therefore is not even available to the current algorithms in the AI ecosystem. This is both frightening in some respect, but also extremely empowering. It means that we have competitive edge as a continent that we are yet to utilize. And that massive engineering reserve of all these people in auto garages, in the artisanal realm, whose credentials are not recognized by the so-called formal system, constitute an incredible reserve that, properly utilized, properly harnessed, will be this continent's salvation. What we are asking for then is to capacitate them. The new artificial intelligence mechanisms, the new technologies that are coming to become embedded, requires that we find a way to translate their skill set, to translate their capacity, and to make it more visible, to make it more codifiable, so that they can be invested in and they can be plugged into the economy in a much more effective way. So when we say that we have 3 million jobs in the formal sector, 15 million needed to be created, we should not ignore the fact that about 10 million of that gap is made up of the informal sector, many of them in parts of the economy that are actually waiting for transformation. So let me give you, to wrap up this vision. Just imagine a situation where an informal, artisanal garage becomes a mechanization hub for agriculture, where these people that are currently doing fabrication for minor tools here and there and the likes are now equipped with capacity to generate some of those inputs into things like sensors, into repairing drones, into using these things for some degree of precision agriculture, and therefore serving the mechanization needs of subsistence agriculture. Now imagine that kind of world. And then go to the IMF data sets and look at their projections for how much AI will add to the African economy, and you discover a fascinating and incredible allegory. If AI adoption continues on a business as usual basis, and yes, still we have widespread adoption, the added value to GDP is merely 0.2%. Regional GDP, I mean, African GDP. Merely 0.2%. Yet, according to the IMF, were we to absorb AI into agriculture so that it transforms the very foundations of that sector, the added value to regional GDP is 4%. We are talking about 20x. From adopting AI widely, but on a business as usual scenario, versus adopting AI into agriculture on a transformative basis, we get a 20x differential. That's what we are talking about. That is the job spiral. The job spiral is recognizing that that gap that you are talking about from 3 million to 15 million is not zero. It's not a vacuum. It's a gap of informality. Africans always find a way, but sometimes the way that they find in the informal sector lacks recognition, lacks amplification, lacks recognition, and therefore, for that reason, it's not sufficiently productive. Our task, our duty as elites in this room is how we utilize the new mechanisms that are coming so that this informality stops becoming a curse and gradually become the actual foundation of the economy. So rather than to think of it as something that we just simply need to formalize away, we need to think of informality as a reservoir. As a reservoir. Thank you very much.
Many thanks to you, Bright. Very insightful presentation. I did see quite a few members in the audience taking photos of your slides as a result of the new information that you released. And I think the presentation by Bright, as well as the presentation by His Excellency Kikwete, have teed up the next conversation that will take place quite nicely. And so allow me, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce the moderator for this discussion. She is the Chief of Staff of Africa 50, Ms. Alice Usanasi.
Good morning, everyone. A warm welcome again to joining us to this very critical session because we cannot talk about future if we don't talk about the evolution of the workforce of the continent. By doing so, with the set that has been done, I think the key driving thought I invite my panelists today was really about what Bright ends on, which is about informality. How do we formalize our workforce? On that note, please allow me to welcome my distinguished panelists, Honorable Minister Tessio Sagara, Minister of Capital Mobilization and Domestic Private Investment in Rwanda. I'm also joined by Mohamed, nicknamed Mo Doji, from Metal Company. And also Mr. Mazen Norway, CEO of MTN Digital Company. We ended on the note of informality. So maybe I will start with our own country host representative and also leader in industrialization across the continent more. So I will start with the first question from you. Your company has evolved from a trading company to manufacturing, agro-processing. You have expanded across 10 countries. You are involved in mining. You're employing former workforce of more than 40,000. How has been the role of actual hard infrastructure in that process, and particularly the strategy of your digitalization in that growth?
Yeah, so first and foremost, the theme of the conference is that we understand that Africa is in need of a lot of capital for infrastructure, and what we have access of is half of that. But if you look at Tanzania, we start with power. The total generation power that Tanzania produces is about 1,500 megawatts. And the consumption is around 1,500 megawatts. So the government has invested in a hydro dam at the Stigler's Gorge, wanting to produce 2,400 megawatts. Now, power is a very, very important infrastructure. And we saw that there was a funding gap, but the Tanzanian government has really worked very hard in deploying its own capital to be able to successfully launch this Stigler's Gorge, where they will be producing 2,400 megawatts. So I believe Tanzania will be having access to power, access to competitive price power. This will set the stage for digital investments like data centers. And then, of course, we do have some challenges in terms of transmission, where I think the PPP model is potentially going to work. So I think, we are sitting on a big asset, and I think this is also going to drive a lot of manufacturing because manufacturing requires a lot of power, and so does mining, and so on and so forth. On the second, there was a World Bank report in 2013 that I read that if Tanzania was to fix their port, the GDP would increase by 2 to 3%. Now, recently, you must have heard that we have signed a deal with DP World. DP World has come in and invested $250 million in Tanzanian ports. And already the volumes have doubled. The time that the ships were spending outside waiting to dock has reduced into half, and therefore costs have reduced. More throughput of containers means more taxes for the government. That means more competitive pricing for manufactured goods for Tanzanians. So I think we have made a big shift, and METL Group is wanting to invest in a dry port, knowing that Tanzania is a corridor to East and Central Africa, and Tanzania is industrializing. So we are wanting to invest about $250 million in building the dry port and connecting the rail network into this dry port, and then also setting up a stage for a special economic zone where industries can come and set up their manufacturing. So these are the couple of issues that I want to start with that I think Tanzania have done wonderfully well under the stewardship of our current president. So we're in the right direction and trajectory.
Thank you. Talking about how the importance of policy for industrialization in the continent, in the countries, or investing as well in the right infrastructure, hardcore, be able to fast track that industrialization journey. I think one of the countries that has been a leader across the continents around digital infrastructure, but also hard infrastructure, has been Rwanda. In particular for you, Honorable Minister, you're one of the stakeholders on this side that have been on both sides. You run the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Rwanda, which was focusing on hard infrastructure. You built the Kigali Innovation City, and now you're mobilizing capital and public investments in Rwanda. So at that intersection of infrastructure, capital, skills, where does real transformation and sustainable jobs happen?
Thank you very much, and thank you for having us. I'll start with the lesson learned and then also talk about what we've done. Just based off the discussions we've had today, where I believe we need to go is move away from, I think in the past you're told, start with the enablers, the policy, the regulations, and then the infrastructure and the skills, and then the infrastructure and capital will follow. When you look at how fast technology is transforming our economies, and maybe it will take a bit longer for Africa, but even changing globally, I think we need to shorten that process and we need to integrate it. There's a lot of room for us to try and do everything at once so that we're also not locked into policies that will take so long to shift before you, that will take much longer to shift, and then you find you're locking out investment. So to bring that to life, in Rwanda, in our case for digital infrastructure, the vision was set as early as 2000. We said we want ICT to be a future economic growth driver. Once that vision was set, putting in the policies in place, setting up the institutions, building the infrastructure, we built the fiber backbone across the country in the 2000s, before, very early on, including investing as government ourselves. And also making sure every infrastructure project that was being built made provision for fiber, so you didn't have to go back and dig up roads and so on. In skills, we started partnering with world-class universities, Carnegie Mellon, so that we could build world-class African talent on the continent. This was early 2010. And then others came through, and this is what anchored the Innovation City, where Africa 50 eventually came in to help us kick off the ground. And so many more. I think we believe in the importance of talent density so we can make it easy for skilled people to come and work. And then that led to us being able to create services that were digitized. A lot of our public services are digitized in a Rwandan-owned company. We've just launched eCash, which is our payment system. So the foundations for digital public infrastructure, we're also building. Most of them are being built locally by local teams who've benefited from these investments that have been made over the years in policy, in institutions, in skills, and in services. So we're seeing the benefits today, but at the same time, we also recognize that the landscape is changing, and it's changing much faster. What has taken 15, 20 years to build over time, I think that technology, people call it in a waterfall method. I don't think we have that luxury anymore as a continent, and I think we need to start thinking in a more integrated manner. So what that looks like is today, we're doing it in healthcare, for instance, for vaccine manufacturing. You have the anchor investors, you're building the skills in line with what they need, you're building the regulations at the same time, you're empowering your FDA. at the same time. And I think we need to be able to multiply that across all the different industries we are talking about, including in critical minerals, even when we talk about data centers and so on, because people will tell you, we can't come in and do processing because you don't have power. And then the power investors will say, well, we don't have demand and offtake, so we can't come in. So I think if we keep doing, the reason why our projects end up not being as productive as they could be is that we need to do a lot of the orchestration from the beginning. If it's the anchor industry, you build the skills, you build the infrastructure, and also the capital. I think that's how we start to de-risk, and that's how we start to take advantage of the assets from day one. And then we're not waiting and saying, let's build skills that we're not sure if they'll be relevant when this investment comes. So where we need to get to if we really want to take advantage is this integration from day one of planning, and we reduce the fragmentation that tends to happen. And a key part of that will be us defining our vision for not just for digital infrastructure, I would say for what does the future economy look like for the continent. And that goes beyond the digital jobs. I think the scene setting was really important. We're still very unproductive in agriculture. We're not irrigating enough. You'll find we don't have enough irrigation technicians on the continent. Those are jobs, when we talk about the formal jobs, those should also be the jobs that we focus on. And we use technology to empower the people who do that. And not, we shouldn't just be talking about coding and forgetting some of these critical jobs, same as services and hospitality and health. There's still so many jobs that we can do as that won't be disrupted. Instead, they will be amplified by AI and technology. And that gap is so big, and we need to start to fill it. So I think if we can set the vision and have more integrated planning and move away from the waterfall-like planning and implementation, we'll be able to capitalize on the opportunity that we have today.
And I think that goes to the point that Brian was also mentioning earlier around the concept of enclave technology versus embedded technology. And I think that really goes well to the next speaker we have today. Honorable Minister just mentioned about the concept of anchor industry integration and also building today for what you will need tomorrow. And I think one of the most emblematic projects that your company in partnership with Africa 50 has been undertaking is the East-to-West fiber corridor, which crosses many countries from Zambia, Mozambique. We heard the Minister of ICT here and the Honorable Minister of Finance as well, to the Republic of Congo. It is such an example of how actually across markets you can have an integrated workforce at the same time. But beyond faster connectivity, what are the capabilities, industries, and jobs do you expect this such large infrastructure to unlock to make sure that actually, as was mentioning earlier, we are building sustainable jobs and not shallow jobs?
Thank you very much, and also thank you for having us here. I represent MTN. MTN is one of the leading telecommunications companies on the continent, operating in more than 18 markets, serving more than 300 million customers across all the footprints. Yes, we don't exist in all the markets, but with Africa 50 as a strategic partner and with the others, we are expanding our footprint specifically on digital infrastructure to the other markets. And one example you gave us now is the strategic project that we are driving to create a connectivity across the continent using the fiber from the east to the west, not only to rely on the subsea and the critical issues impacting the subsea. So the east to west is one of the critical programs. And the Route 1 moving from Kenya to South Sudan to Central Africa and to the Congo B, and will be definitely supplemented by at least 2 other routes, which will be crossing different markets. So back to your question here, we have segmented our business into 3 platforms. There is a connectivity business, which is really the mobile, and that's already well matured. 300 million plus customers directly benefiting from this platforms. The second, which is really the fintech, and the inclusivity of financial services is key to enable the digital transformation across the continent. And thirdly, the digital infrastructure. We are strong believers and definitely leveraging the regulators and the government's approach. We are strongly believing in open access model. And that's the approach that we took to start really putting more focus on how we can really also expose our infrastructure to be used not only by MTN, by us for our own customers, but also to be used by others and by the governments, by the enterprises, by the multinationals, and by the private sector. So now on the capabilities, let me give you an example from a private sector, from a telecommunication, from a technology company. When we look as an example on engineers, we are not expecting an engineer to just repair a fault as an example. We're looking for type of engineers not only to repair, but rather than understand the root cause of the faults, as an example, be able to find a way to prevent the faults to happen, be able to design solutions, cost-effective solutions, to really make sure that there is no repetitive faults happening. This is an example of kind of capabilities that we are working hard to really ensure it's available to support the digital infrastructure deployments across all the projects and the program that we are involved in. 30 years back, there was a problem with demand and supply. However, with the evolvement of the technologies, the introduction of the internet, the telecommunication, the mobile, the demand has already been elevated, and the supply also benefited from the contribution of the technology to the overall GDP. So the education systems has been improving. So now the issue is not about demand and supply. The issue is more about how to make sure the resources that has been already acquired by the private sector, by the technology companies, including us, how can we make sure those resources are having enough capabilities, not only to run the day-to-day, but rather than also contribute to the overall the transformation and the expansion, and definitely the sustainable solution that we need to put for the long term. And here, what we have done as an example, we segmented our approach in not only to acquire resources, but just also to develop the resources, focusing on 3 categories of competencies. Category number 1, look at the future fit technologies, whether it is cloud, whether it's AI, whether it is sustainable energy, whether it's cybersecurity, all those future fit, we need to prepare the existing resources to really understand and run those technologies. The second category is more about business acumen. We want our people not only to understand the technology, but also to be able to run business modeling, business analysis, profit and loss, financial reporting, understand. The engineer not only to run a technology, rather engineer also to analyze the business impact of the technology. And third category is about the leadership. It's more about people management, it's about communication, it's about negotiations, about stakeholders management. Those 3 categories formulate our approach in terms of driving the capabilities that we are trying to continue developing for us, and definitely we're becoming as an academy at the end, because many of our resources that we have acquired and we have built and we have developed, they are currently really working for other sectors, and also in the banks, in the financial system, in the mining, in the government as well. So our message here is not only for our own core business, but other also to make sure that also benefiting the whole industry.
On that note of movement of people, and I'll maybe just come back to Mo, and hopefully the next set of responses we can keep them short in the interest of time. In terms of some skills moving to others, you identified logistics as one of your area of expansion. You mentioned investing in dry ports. As we speak about artificial intelligence, automation, when you look at the type of investment that you're doing, is it still more around equipment, or is it really around soft digitization to make process more efficiency? And the type of people you hire to do that, you have to train them yourself, or are you seeing the movement of skills that Mazen was talking about?
I think MTL is looking at a digital strategy. To give you a little bit of context, when I graduated from university, when I came to Tanzania in the late 1990s, then per capita income was $300, which was about $25 a month. So I was always wondering that how will I be able to do well and generate wealth? So I decided following those $25, and I realized that 90% of that money that was spent was in basic fast-moving consumables. So we ended up setting edible oil refineries, soap manufacturing, detergents, textiles, anything that could cater to the bottom of the pyramid. Why? And we fought against big brands like Unilever and Procter & Gamble. Today, we are competing with Coca-Cola with our own home-grown colas and are being very, very competitive because we are conscious of value for money for an Africa. Now, today, if you look at Africa's GDP, $3.5 trillion, there's 1.2, 1.3 billion people. If you take a Nigeria out, a South Africa out, and maybe Morocco, Algeria out, you have an Africa with per capita income of $1,000. That is $90 a month. Out of that $90, $70 of those precious dollars are being spent on fast-moving consumables. So now I come to your point. What is METL's strategy? One day I was researching and I realized that the price of products that we sell at wholesale and the price of a product that the consumer buys at retail is 20 to 25% higher. So we have a digital strategy. A is to create an e-commerce platform to do B2B, but B2C. Now this way, the consumer, when you talk about saving the consumer 10% or 15% on $70, that's $7 to $10 a month. That is a lot of money that you're leaving on the table because of inefficiency. So we're using a digital strategy to bring efficiency to drive down prices for the consumer. So A, we will have e-commerce. B, we will have our own payment gateway and our own ecosystem. Which is whether it is a wallet-based payment system, but it will be able to give digital money access who can then use the e-commerce platform to buy. And then three, on top of that, is we're going to create a fintech on the back of it that will lend in that money wallet, and in return, they will buy in and get a loyalty program and therefore save money. Now, this way, everybody wins. So you're using a digital platform to bring efficiency from the seller side, but most importantly, you're saving those precious dollars to the end consumer.
Thank you. So thinking about the end consumers and what Mo just mentioned, I'll come back to you, Honorable Minister. His Excellency earlier mentioned that as we think about the education program and the digital skills and how we need to, more than 230 million youth, we need digital skills. That means we're going to have to evolve and adapt our education program, but there's also the existing skills force. So as a government, from a policy perspective and investment perspective, how do you ensure that not only you are adapting your existing education program, but you're also reskilling the existing workforce to be able to adapt to the next generation of industries that they have to serve?
Thank you. We just set up an AI agency, and it's not even a starting point. We had a partnership before in 2019 with the World Economic Forum, and it's really to help us start to answer these questions. How do you educate in a world of AI? We've already worked on trying to increase as much access to electricity, access to digital tools, and so on in schools. But to scale that up and make sure you're still managing at scale, because you have enclaves of excellence, coding academies, the universities, and so on. But how do you start to do this at scale from pre-primary? And I think that's such a challenge that we're all facing. But where we're seeing, for example, in healthcare, because of digitization and being able to see incidences of hotspots of health of diseases and incidences of diseases and changes. That data is then used to inform how we procure, how we you don't stock out on certain medicines and so on. I think education is much more difficult. We're using some elements for teacher management, for teacher training as well, so that you can get them ready. But it's the most difficult out of everything to make sure that you're constantly shifting the education system to be relevant. On the workforce side, it's been easier to work with investors and then de-risk their own training, where you contribute, they contribute, and there's some additional incentives for them to be able to take on who they've trained. We've done that in manufacturing, we've done that in global business services for the outsourcing, and we've seen a lot of success because beyond the foundations you've given them, they're able to then immediately hire people who have been trained for the work that they're going to do. So I think those will need to continue with respect to upskilling. And then finally, I think we need to work a lot on visibility into what people do. You have, we can, every time there's a construction project, it's like most construction workers, you're starting from scratch with a workforce to say who's available. So to the extent we can start to help use technology to build credentials for the labor force, and I think that was the conversation on the informality. Going forward, it will help. And I think it's not impossible. Most of our populations are now connected. You can see by the amount of time that's spent on TikTok, on the social media platforms. So it's not something that is impossible. I think it's more around the intentionality that we need to make sure for the skills that we need in collaboration with the private sector. But at the policy level, what at least we're making sure that we know how to keep up with the trends, and then looking at both the education system and then more targeted programming with the private sector to make sure that we're reskilling and keeping up with the job demands.
Mazen, from that enabling environment system, particularly where, when you talk about risk allocation or responsibility allocation, comes more from a government perspective. I think one of the aspects we're discussing is also the cost of digitizing our economies, which is both heavy from a government perspective, but also from an investor perspective. What's the key constraint for you? You see, particularly when you undertake, when we're talking about market being integrated, and which is also on the back end of the project you mentioned earlier. What's the key enabling constraint do you face as you seek to implement such large-scale intra-market connectivity program?
Yeah, I mean, the first point is more about the policies. I mean, how much the policies are supporting the private sector investments strategies. And I think to a large extent, in most of our markets where we've been working, this subject has been well, let's say, managed and supported. We've seen very good progress made lately across different markets where the governments have had a well-established policy to support the overall investment strategies here. The other area which is really important is the infrastructure is really wide here. And there is a need to have a collaborative approach between private and public sector to really run, although really needed to build what is really required across all the sectors here. So the power is an example. The security is another example. All those really factors are key, plus definitely the stabilization of the economy, because when you bring, let's say, foreign currency to the country and the economy does not really support the stability, that's also create threat, and also because our investors who are looking for definitely returns. But there is one more subject which is also constraints here, which is also relevant to the overall theme of this panel, is about resources. I mean, historically, we have managed to resolve the subject of the demand and the supply. We managed through the academy to solve the problem of the development of the resources. The problem remain in many sectors, in many markets, how to retain the resources. The migration of the resources to the West remain a challenge. And here we need to put more efforts as a private and public sector. We don't want to continue to be an academy to export resources, qualified resources from Africa to outside of Africa. We need to retain those resources on the continent. It's not really sustainable to develop them, prepare them, and definitely we go to the other part of the world and we see our ex-colleagues are working successfully. And the challenge here is not about not finding a job. The job is available in our continent, however, the supporting systems. So the experts and the qualified resources, they are looking for educational systems, much more sustainable. They are looking more health systems, are supporting their families. They are looking for more stability. All those really factors are important to retain the resources on the continent where we can really build together the future of Africa.
I'm sure His Excellency is very happy to hear that finding jobs is not the issue. And so I will leave you with one last word. If you can give me one last point on how do we resolve then informality if jobs is not an issue. One word. I'll start with Honorable Minister.
Coherence, I think, between what we're doing with across partners and also redefining it as informality, because if you call it informality, and we don't all understand it in the same. So I think there's a need of some coherence around what are we trying to solve, what are we doing as government, as private sector, as the education system, and then bringing it all together so that we're working in the same direction.
Coherence. Mo?
I don't know, I have a side comment. I think from the whole theme of this conference, the shortfall of capital, I think the West and the world is being very unfair on Africa. I think the whole credit rating system for Africa is skewed the wrong way. If you see the way they rate us and the interest that they charge and the amount of outflow of interest payments vis-a-vis the aid that comes in, it's in one way they give us $1 and they make us pay $5. So, and this pains a lot. So that just comes back to us that we as Africans, we need to fix our own problem and, you know, build our own infrastructure and not depend on anyone else.
Okay. So, Africa by Africans. Africa Capital for Africa. Mazen?
I think we're looking for the future and we are not looking for short term. So strong partnerships are key to really build the future between private sectors, between the different industries across the private sector, and between the private sector and the public sectors. Having a joint agenda for national development strategies are key to really achieve the goals that we are looking for.
So, what's your word?
Partnerships.
Partnership. Great. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us this morning. I think we have a task now for Brian Bright. Coherence in our strategies and investment and policies, making sure that we put domestic capital at the core, working for the continent, and obviously